Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Erica Bernstein, and I work here in the Office of Training and Exercises at the Virginia Department of Emergency Management, and we are pleased to welcome all of you to this afternoon's webinar, Managing Unaffiliated Volunteers in Disasters. Just a few ground rules for today. Because of the large number of callers, as you've noticed, we're muting all lines as you join the session. If you have questions during the session, we want you to ask them. We just ask that you use them in the chat feature, or Amanda's also going to be taking some breaks throughout the presentation, and that's when you can use the Raise the Hand button, which is located directly below the list of participants, and she'll also take questions at the end. I will recognize you by name and unmute your line if you use the little Raise the Hand button. At the end, there will be a brief survey hosted directly through the webinar where we'll be asking for your feedback to include suggestions for future topics, and we would very much appreciate you staying just a minute after the webinar to complete the survey. We are recording this session, and a link will be provided to all of you in about a week or so in case you would like to review the presentation another time. Our presenter for today is Amanda Reidelbach. She joined the Virginia Department of Emergency Management in September 2013 as the Disaster Relief and Volunteers Coordinator. Prior to joining VDEM, she worked for Louisa County from 2006 to 2012. Following the 2011 earthquake that struck that locality, she worked with local community leaders in establishing the Louisa Earthquake Recovery Fund and the Louisa County Long-Term Recovery Group. She now uses the lessons learned during the disasters response and recovery to assist local governments in volunteer and donations management. She also administers the Virginia Disaster Relief Fund. She resides in Louisa County with her husband and their 2 young children, where she enjoys the country life. Amanda, take it away.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining. I do see, Erica, I see a few people that still don't have the call-in symbol next to their name. If you want to maybe follow up with them and make sure that they're getting the audio to this recording.
Yes, those people are most likely the call-in users.
Okay. Great. So today we're going to talk about how you can manage the spontaneous unaffiliated volunteer. I'll give some more details at the end of the session, but today is really Unit 5 of 8 of a much larger training opportunity. It's an opportunity that will be available again in October. So this is just one small section of how your locality can manage spontaneous volunteers, and then also another portion of it is your undesignated donations. I need to make sure I use this forward button, excuse me. So our objectives for today is to help you to understand the difference between a spontaneous volunteer or a spontaneous unaffiliated volunteer and affiliated volunteers. So we're going to talk about the definitions and descriptions of those 2 types of volunteers. We're going to talk about identifying locations for you to establish a volunteer reception center. We're also going to go over how a reception center can look and flow and how it can operate. We'll talk about the referral process of referring volunteer services to volunteer organizations and how that will work within the volunteer reception center. We're going to talk about the interaction between the volunteer reception center local volunteer centers in the response phase, how you can work with them, which is a great resource if you have one within your locality. We're going to talk about matching offered volunteer services to the needs of your event. And we're going to talk about ways to promote in public messaging the correct way for people or the public to volunteer both during the response phase, but then through recovery. So affiliated volunteers, they are individuals who are already attached to a volunteer organization. They can be attached to organizations such as the Red Cross or the Salvation Army, such as the images on the screen. They are trained in a very specific role in disaster response or recovery with their agency. That agency will target a specific need that arises out of a disaster, whether that be feeding operations, debris cleanup, managing spontaneous volunteers, because there are volunteer organizations that are out there that I'll talk about that you can go to help you organize this kind of flood of individuals that will come into your community. And one of the greatest things that they provide to you is they're providing the logistical support to the volunteer in the entire phase. So they understand the feeding operations that are required. They are going to make sure that they're not going to interfere with the recovery or response operations that you already have going on. Some of the examples, such as I said, was the Red Cross, Salvation Army. Many of them are faith-based organizations that are part of the Voluntary Organizations Active in Disaster, or VOAD. Some of them are the Baptist Mission Board or the United Methodist Committee on Relief, called UMCOR. Those organizations, and I really do promote and support working and finding and building relationships with your VOAD organizations that serve your community, because they really are just a wealth of assistance that can come in and really support your operation, allow you focus on what you need to, and then they can support you, coordinate with you, and really help your community towards its recovery. Other affiliated volunteers that are sometimes overlooked are your local volunteer organizations or faith-based groups. So your Rotary, your Lions Club, or your local churches. Your local churches may have a women's group that does outreach services. And that is a great organized group of people that have the same mission of helping people, that in an event you can go to and kind of redirect their attention to a disaster-caused need. And they are organized. They know how to do reference checks. They provide the logistics that's needed to support the volunteer. And they're just a real asset and resource that's right in your community. One thing a lesson learned that I had with local churches is that they, through their denomination, are affiliated through these VOAD organizations. And some of your churches may not know that. So if you have a large Methodist community, they are affiliated by their denomination to UMCOR. If you have a large Baptist community, they are or can be affiliated based on their denomination to either the Southern Baptist Convention Committee on Relief or the Virginia Baptist Mission Board. So it's a conversation that you can have with them, and then the larger organization can support your local smaller church groups. So there's just a lot of resources out there that are available. So your spontaneous, unaffiliated volunteers. These are individuals that have been motivated by some degree of either community ownership, so they live within your locality, but they may not have been flooded, or the tornado may not have hit their home, and they want to help their community. They could be individuals from out of state that see some national media, and they see a need, and they see pain and suffering, and they want to get together and go and help. And they have no association with a disaster-focused voluntary organization. They are kind of referred to as the second disaster, because it does take a lot of resources and time to coordinate and manage these groups of people that come into your community. But they should be really seen as individuals that have skills, that are going to be able to help in the response, and then into your early short-term recovery phases, and then even into long-term recovery, because they have skills. They could be an accountant. They could have construction skills, which is definitely a skill that's very useful in a housing recovery. They could have food services skills and training as their career. So if you have a shelter operation, you can bring them in and assist with feeding either your volunteers, your survivors, or your first responders. And IT is another thing to look at because we have become so committed to using technology that when we're standing up different instant command posts, for example, or going to stand up a volunteer reception center, having somebody with IT background can be beneficial to help you with your computer needs or running wires and cables. And a common acronym that is used to refer to these group of people are SUVs. So they're not cars, they're spontaneous unaffiliated volunteers. Oh, I'm sorry, let me go back one thing. One thing that's important to really, and probably many of you in the emergency management community have concerns about when it comes to the unaffiliated volunteers and then the affiliated organizations, is liability. When you have an unaffiliated or an SUV come into your community after an event, there's no insurance coverage on them, there's no training, they have no logistical support. So it's important to understand that liability issue and who's responsible for them. So getting them to affiliate is important in that arena. I don't see anybody entering any chat questions, but if anything pops in your head while I'm talking, feel free to enter the question into the chat. We'll be breaking here in just a little bit. We can answer those questions then or as being presented. So some of the key stakeholders that you have in your community for managing SUVs are they're going to start with you. They're going to start with the emergency management community and your plans. What you have in your EOP, if you have or are in the process, I know many localities are in the process of writing detailed annexes or Annex I, I'm not sure, to their EOPs that deal with volunteer management. And what are we going to do when that horde of individuals come into the community? So it really is going to start with emergency management. The next group or groups of people that are going to be a real asset to you is if you have a volunteer center in your community. Not all counties in Virginia or localities in Virginia have a volunteer center. But if you do, you count yourself among the lucky because these organizations know how to bring untrained, unaffiliated volunteers into the fold of volunteerism. They know how to document hours. They know how to document the individuals. They may be able to do your background checks for you. They are going to be just a real asset to you. So if you have a volunteer center in your community, reach out to them and try to build a relationship. See if they will become your lead partner in managing your volunteer management process. Another group are going to be VOAD members. Many of them, if not all of them, have some mechanism to bring spontaneous volunteers into the fold. Okay, Mike Guzzo actually just asked me a question about how does a community know if they have one. I will follow up with the group with a specific website, but there is, if you go and search through the State Department of Social Services, it has an office that deals with community service and volunteerism. And in that, there is a link that lists all the volunteer centers that operate in Virginia. And they are affiliated through the Volunteer Centers of Virginia. So I'll send that link to the group so that you all can look and see if you have a volunteer center within your community. VOAD members. As I was saying, They know how to bring volunteers. Many of them have a specific capability and support function that their role in a disaster response is to help a community deal with the spontaneous volunteers. One organization that comes to mind is the Red Cross. The Red Cross has the forms already written. They have volunteers trained in how to stand up a volunteer center and begin vetting volunteers. What you can do from emergency management perspective is work on how they get referred, which we'll talk about in another couple of slides. How do you refer these volunteers that are coming into your community that have no training, no coverage? Who do they go to? How do you pick who they get to work with? So you can look to any number of partners there. Faith-based organizations, community leaders, they're going to be part of your recovery and your ongoing effort. And then the media. The media is really key because you're going to be communicating through them what your needs are when it comes to volunteers. Do you need more? Do you need less? Do you have a specific skill set that is of need? So you can use the media to get your message out there. So some general planning that you should consider if you're in the process of writing your annex is identify existing local volunteer coordination process and protocols. What I mean by that is if you have a volunteer center in your community, they have a process, and you should get to know them and understand what is their process and how can you bring that process instead of rewriting the wheel. I'm a long-standing government employee. I like copy and paste, and I think many of you out there like to copy and paste too, because why reinvent the wheel? If there's something already written in a plan, if there are already procedures written on how to operate, use them. So you can look and see if someone already has something going on in your community. Take those processes and fold them into your annex and your EOP. You need to identify a volunteer intake coordinating agency. I've mentioned many times the Volunteer Coordination Center or Volunteer Center. That's just one option. Every locality is going to be able to make their own choice on what organization is going to serve as your intake. And this is something that I've, again, learned through doing in my experience with Louisa County and our event, is look to an organization to do the work for you. Don't feel that you as the local government need to be responsible for doing the entire thing. It is just another program to bring into your fold of emergency management. So I try to identify whether it be a volunteer center, whether it be the Red Cross, whether it be your local Ruritan or your local church down the road that is going to serve as your intake agency. They're going to be the ones that you will go to when the need arises to stand up your volunteer reception center. They'll be doing the paperwork. They have the resource list of what materials are needed to run the center, how much square footage, all of that. And once you've identified and started that conversation with that group, you're going to want to look to entering into an MOU about staffing, equipment needs, resource needs, call downs, all of that the things that you'll need to write into your plan. And then also what what I recommend you write into your plan and consider is you need to determine the physical location of the volunteer reception center. So the next slide is just a basic diagram, and I borrowed this from Denny Huff out from Roanoke. I believe he's further out in Southwest Virginia now, and he assisted with Washington County in standing up a volunteer reception center in 2011 to help with the tornadoes that impacted that community. And in this diagram, it really shows that you need a lot of space. You will need a waiting area. It's recommended that you have separate ingress and egress. You want people coming in one way, working their way through the room, and exiting back out the other side. Some of the main areas that this organization will do for you is the initial orientation and safety. To talk to the spontaneous volunteers who are coming in, the basic needs that have arisen, the opportunities that they have to volunteer, and safety concerns based on the disaster. If it's a flooding event, they're going to talk about contamination, whether or not maybe the public water was impacted, or if septic and sewer was breached and entered into and flooded homes, if there's any other kind of hazardous materials, tornadoes, whether or not it's safe with building integrity. So they're going to talk about stuff like that. Then they're going to start processing them. They're going to get them to fill out forms, basic information, what are your skills, what are your abilities, and then background checks and so on and so forth. And one of the things that they're really going to talk about is, in this reception center, is, we might not have anything for you to do today, but what is your availability tomorrow or the next day or 2 weeks or 2 months from now? Because the real work happens a little bit longer, a little bit further along. Response is usually very well handled by the emergency management community, but as you start to transition in, there's a lot more work for volunteers to come into your system and help out. And here are just a few pictures that will show you what a reception center can look like. So in the top left, that's the basic intake. You can see in this event they've got 5 or 6 intake workers taking information from the volunteers. The next picture to the right is a waiting area. So just from that picture you can see how much space you may need. I did add the picture on the bottom center to highlight one organization that some localities you might not think of, but I think is a great organization, and that's Hope Animal Assistance in Crisis. I think I said that name correctly. They have crisis response canines who come in and provide kind of a stress relief. Because your volunteers will be under stress, the workers that are working in the center are going to be under a level of stress. You'll have your responders and groups coming in and and they're not just in your volunteer reception center, but the Hope Animal Crisis Response, they can help your first responders, and they can also help your disaster survivors. I just think that they're a great organization to think about bringing in after an event, because they just really help people begin the healing process from the trauma of their disaster. Some of the considerations that you need to take into place when you are thinking about reception centers is square footage. How large of a space will you need? It's really recommended you're looking at about a gymnasium, but you can do it in much smaller spaces. It's going to be disaster driven. How large is your disaster? What is the population of your community? And what is the feeling that you have as far as how large of a spontaneous response will you have can drive your square footage needs. So when you are outlining in your plan, consider having multiple locations throughout the community, just as you have with your shelters, that have large square footage or large footprints, or multiple rooms within a structure. Parking is something that you need to consider, as well as ingress and egress, both for the parking as well as in and out of the reception center. So some potential locations you can think of. Schools, a lot of us always think of schools right off the bat. That may or may not work. because schools are primarily used as shelters, and if it's during the school year, it's used as a school. So having or standing it up as a reception center may not be the best use of it, especially listing them as your primary reception center. But it may be valuable for you to keep in your plan. The schools might be an option should it be summertime and a non-sheltering event. Churches, especially your large churches, are a great option. Those that have large gymnasiums or large community centers, it's really a great place. It's already built for parking, your ingress and egress, and your church community is going to want to be a part of your response and recovery as well. So churches are probably going to be your first look to see what church organizations or faith-based organizations. I do use the term church loosely. It can refer to both those of Christian faith or Islamic or Jewish faith traditions. So when I do say church, I'm not trying to separate any other faiths, but any of those organizations. Another place could be vacant business storefronts or industrial buildings. Just an option if you know that they're in your community. It's a great place to potentially set up a reception center. Or if it comes down to it, set up a tent. Being outside in a field is an option. Could be a little more difficult because you will have to bring much more material as far as seating, setting up tents and tables to a location. But depending upon your event, it's definitely an option. So this is the opportunity that I do have for questions. I've received a number of questions that have been sent, I think, to me privately, so I will try to address some of them. If you have a question, please use the icon that will raise your hand. There's a little raise your hand button. You should see the list of all the attendees, and then there's a button that says raise your hand. So if you have a question and need your line unmuted, please raise your hand. Let's see here. So one question is, does the Red Cross or any VOADs manage SUV at the scene? I think I talked about that a little bit, but the answer is yes. Red Cross is an organization I know of right off the bat that they can be brought on scene and manage spontaneous volunteers. The key is working with the Red Cross chapter that serves your locality before the event so that you can establish the plan, know who to call and dispatch and bring in so that they can stand that up. Another question is, concerns should not only be for insurance but background or other checks depending on who they are working with and around. And that is extremely important. You're exactly right. One of the stations in a volunteer reception center is the background check table. So when they use spontaneous volunteers, you bring them into the waiting room, give them a basic background, and start the application process. When they identify certain skills that are needed, they move on to background checks. They consent to a criminal background check. You will need to identify within your plan who will be conducting that background check. So look to either your police or sheriff's departments to see if they have the capability of running instant background checks or running them for you. There are some school systems now that have background checking systems in place. So your local school division may have a system or software program that they could do the background checks. So those are things that you'll need to consider case by case on how you do background checks. And other checks are important, because one thing you'll be looking at and watching is, does this individual volunteer have the physical means to carry out the work that they want to do. Meaning not that people with functional or access needs can't volunteer, but they may not be best suited for the activity that they want. Meaning somebody with some access or functional needs may not be the best person to send to work on a chainsaw crew. Not that they'll be operating a chainsaw, but they would be hauling wood and throwing wood. So they may not be somebody you're going to send over there. But they could help run your volunteer reception center. Or they could go into your EOC and help you document damage assessments. Or any number of small administrative skills or needs that arise in an event. So there's a lot of ways that you can look at them, and you're right, you definitely have to consider background checks and other checks. Let's see. Do I have... one question is, would local recreation center or malls be an option for a volunteer reception center? And I would say yes. Recreation centers are great options because, again, they have large spaces. They probably have a gymnasium of some sort. That's a great option. Malls could be an option. That is something that you would need to work out with the mall owner, I think, beforehand and enter into an MOU with them. If you have a mall that's in your community, in a relationship with them, and see if they could set up a center. I think malls is a really good idea because you may actually increase your base or your pool of volunteers because your general shopper may be going through there. Putting on my old public affairs hat, it's also another great location where you could talk about your response and recovery efforts and then also message the best way to support your recovery, whether it be through volunteering, affiliating, or giving money. So I think malls would be a really good option. You may want to, I think a comment, you may also want to reach out to local DSS offices for background check availability. Okay, so there's another option for you. Are background checks reimbursable public assistance eligible items for public safety issues? I do not know that answer and would not tread to answer that one. So I will defer public assistance eligibility to our Recovery and Mitigation Division. So I would check with Nelia Dabney, or we can check with Nelia and see if it's a reimbursable expense. One more comment, I think this may be the last one. On the liability issue, are we referring all volunteers who come into a VOAD so they are covered under the VOAD? What if they don't wish to be affiliated with an organization, they just want to help this one time? That is a challenging conundrum. It's difficult when an individual comes in and says they want to help for you to feel that it's okay to tell them no. But if your locality makes the decision that it wants to refer all spontaneous volunteers to affiliate underneath of an organization, it doesn't have to be a VOAD organization, but it needs to be under some organization, so that other organization can take on the logistical support requirements as well as the liability coverage or waiver, because they will go through that process. They will either do an informed consent that they are waiving their liability and that their own private insurance will take care of them. But that's where having them affiliate is going to be the best option for you as a locality. And if they don't want to affiliate under an organization, then you can tell them no. Or you can say, okay, we want you to sit behind this desk. So it will be case by case, and it will be up to you. I highly recommend that you work to pushing may not be the correct term, but strongly encouraging that spontaneous volunteers affiliate. And you can do that through the education process. Explain to them why. Explain to them that by just having a whole bunch of volunteers working all over the place makes it more burdensome on the response and into recovery, whereas if they work with an organization, it's much more streamlined. So I think we are going to close the lines and move on. If you have any other questions, feel free to send them again. We'll do more questions at the end. So elsewhere in your plan, you may cover how do you coordinate the affiliated volunteer response. Who calls your regional VOAD and submits a request? Does your locality have that your plan says all requests for volunteers go through VDEM? And then they're assigned to ESF 17 and they work through me, and I'll work with the VOAD organizations or other volunteer organizations to help in your response. That is a place to look back and say, what is your process? In your reception center, you will know or learn very early on which organizations have been requested to come into your community, because either one, you've asked for them specifically, you knew that I'll use the Baptist Mission Board. You know that the Baptist Mission Board does chainsaw crews for exterior debris removal, and you called them and said, come in. Or you may have other needs that you've put in through VDEM and through me, and we've coordinated and brought organizations in. So you know you've got 3, 5, 10 affiliated, organized volunteer groups in your community. You want to determine the process through which your unaffiliated volunteers are assigned or referred to those organizations. Will you put up a list of volunteer opportunities? Your affiliated groups come in and say, I need 5 volunteers to carry out these activities, and you've got basically kind of like a help wanted board. Then your volunteers know who they go to. So it's really determining what are the priority needs. Is debris removal your priority? Do you need to clear the roads in order to get to the homes, to get the people out? Is that what you need to get to first? So it's going to be case by case, but you'll need to make these considerations in your event and in your plan on how do you refer your spontaneous to your affiliated volunteer organizations, and how do you prioritize the needs of your community so that the organization conducting the primary function gets the most volunteers. And again, I am not an attorney. I am not a risk management supervisor by any means. So it will be important for you to research any existing liability issues or laws that affect unaffiliated volunteers. Work with your risk management and work with your county or city attorney in understanding what that would be. Part of the process is going to also be educating your local coalitions. And I actually see that I may have titled this place as far as SUV referral and placement maybe a little off. But it's really educating your community. So some of the work that you'll need to do beforehand is building a community network, knowing what organizations already operate within your locality, how are they potentially affiliated larger up, what are their desires, how do they want to help? Instead of, you going to them and say, I have this need, maybe switch the conversation around and go to these organizations and say, what do you want to do? And then, kind of reverse engineer it a little bit. Engage your business community. Business communities or businesses many times in today's world have a volunteer force. They support volunteerism. They allow their employees a certain amount of time off to volunteer. They also can support with donations particularly in-kind donations, if you need water, if you need building materials, if you need space. So engage your business community. And then also be sure to establish what are your reporting procedures. Who is going to report to whom? Where will your volunteer and donation coordination team reside within your plan? Will you have it as within, say, ESF 14 and recovery? Will you have it in economic community redevelopment? Will you have its own section, and who will it report to, and how will it transition into recovery? So those are some of the things that you need to consider in writing your plan or reviewing your plan and thinking about how you want to manage volunteers in a disaster event. And public messaging. The number one thing that you want to say every opportunity that you have when you are in the media's eye is affiliate, affiliate, affiliate. You as the emergency manager want to have one point of contact with an organization. You want to have one point of contact with the Red Cross. The Red Cross may have 200 volunteers. You want to have one point of contact with the Salvation Army. They have 300 volunteers. You don't want to have a relationship with 500 volunteers. So putting it in very simple terms, affiliation is where you need to go. These are the organizations that are helping us right now. Name them. When you're standing up at your press briefing, say the Red Cross is here, the Salvation Army is here, UMCOR is here, Islamic Relief is here. Please join one of these organizations to help us through our response and recovery. This is how you get to them. Explain in your media appearances how spontaneous response can overwhelm your system, that you have a very finite amount of resources and personnel that are focused on protecting life and safety and stabilizing the event, and you cannot afford to take those individuals away from that responsibility to manage volunteers or unaffiliated volunteers. And then also message that a large majority of the volunteer need is going to occur during recovery. This initial response by your spontaneous volunteers impact you during response. The vast majority of your needs will be during recovery. So communicating that in the beginning so that they know, I'm going to have plenty of time to help these people. I've got weeks, months, maybe even years to come in and help this community get back to the way that it is, may help kind of stem the tide of spontaneous volunteerism. And another message is give money. Talk about money up front. I'm not afraid of money. I will tell everybody and anybody, give money. Money is the best way to help in the response and recovery. You can outline, you can make the choice of whether you will specifically list the organizations that are working with you. You can refer them to the Virginia VOAD, and that those organizations will be able to come in and help. Or this is something we will talk about in the next webinar, is standing up a local recovery fund. And if you make the choice to stand up a local recovery fund, promote it. Tell them to give money to it. Gives you control and focus on how your community will recover. So those are some key messaging. Some additional considerations that you should think of and make sure that you're planned for is how will hours be tracked for a potential soft match against the state's cost share for the disaster. So there have been some changes among FEMA for public assistance. This is public assistance that I do know, or at least one area I do know, that if a volunteer organization provides time or resources in the response and some of the early recovery phases that you would have to pay for, that is a recoverable, that is a reimbursable expense that can be used by your locality as the soft cost, or as your local match. So that does now apply to any volunteer organization that supports a sheltering operation. It would apply to organizations that come in and help with your initial debris management, because debris management is part of your PA expenses. There's a lot of opportunities. The Volunteer Reception Center, that is a potential, I don't know for sure with the reception center, a potential soft cost. So tracking all the hours that the different volunteer groups do, as well as what's going on in the center, are really, really important. Have everybody check in, check out, and track those hours. So you'll need to understand or develop a process for tracking those hours. FEMA has revised the policy to allow more volunteer hours to be used, but they still have not provided the form or the tracking methodology that they are going to want. So unfortunately, I can't tell you at this point in time the specific format that they want, but it's better to track it and have the information now, whether it be in spreadsheets, individual timesheets, which is what I would recommend, because they do accept timesheets. But it's a lot of paperwork, and you need to consider that beforehand. So today, I hope that you have been able to learn the difference between that spontaneous volunteer and the affiliated volunteers, and how they're connected or can become connected. How you refer services, how you match offers, how the process for volunteer centers in the response phase, and then gave you some ideas for public messaging. And if there are any more questions, please stay on the line. I'm going to go over questions very quickly. Excuse me, there is a very brief survey at the end of this that'll come up as soon as we're done with questions that we would really appreciate it if you take. Your feedback is important to these webinars, what you thought of this and what you may want out of the next one. So one question is, another affiliated group, a very good point, is your local CERT or your Civil Air Patrol. So absolutely, you can refer people to CERT or your Air Patrol. And I don't see any other questions. Erica, do you want to take over?
Yes, I will.
Okay.
Did you want to talk about the upcoming training first before we put the webinar, or put the survey up?
Sorry, I forgot I had one more slide. Yes, so there is one more webinar. There is one more webinar, August 19th at 10 a.m. It is in the same email that you probably got when you registered for this course through the same SurveyMonkey, managing unsolicited donation and undesignated cash in disasters. It's another unit out of the larger G288 Volunteer and Donations Management course. That's another course that I'll be teaching on October 14th and 15th. It is a full 2-day course. It will be in Manassas. You can sign up for that training by logging into the Knowledge Center and searching for G288. We are adding some additional information to this course that gives more background on the VOAD and the voluntary sector, collaboration and communication between government and voluntary sector, to build on as you then work into writing your volunteer management and your donation management plans. So join me on the 19th or August 19th, or again October 14th and 15th. Thank you all very much.